and I'd be really keen to pick this up. We're hosting, and again, all about influence. We're hosting two. I'm going to talk about two events. One is in Honiton, where Honiton declared, much like Somerset and the smaller parts of Somerset, declared a climate emergency. And they came to us and said, guys, we think that actually helping people to make their homes more energy efficient, i.e. retrofit them, is probably the best move we can make to make the biggest impact. But we've got to influence those individuals to want to do it. So we're hosting an event on April the 2nd, which will be a trial event, and it's going to be all about what you can do to your home to make it more efficient. And we're very aware that for an awful lot of people that there are some enormous barriers there in terms of the outlay cost required to do many of these things. So there's going to be a focus on that. Anyway, I mentioned that one simply because what I'm hoping is that will be a blueprint that we can then roll out. So any representatives of towns in which are either close to or have a Bradfords in them, then we'd be more than welcome to then roll that out and support you doing that beyond there with some good advice from the likes of Trustmark. I know Phil's on this call, but also various local organisations. Just get people together to have that conversation, get some expertise in there. The other thing we do is building sustainable communities, which is our much, I say bigger, that kind of makes it sound better, but it is a much more significant event that we do twice a year, which again, it absolutely sits alongside around that concept of let's make sure that we're informing, engaging and inspiring people so they can start to make those informed choices. So we held our first one in November, which was really successful. Phil, thank you for your contribution to that. But in format, basically get people in to really help people understand what this is all about and give them some detail depending on the theme that we choose. And last time we talked very much about why are we worrying about all this, and what is the challenge around both new build and retrofit. And then we bring in a whole load of our suppliers to showcase what they're doing around the products that can support doing it. And there are some really awesome products out there that really, as Bradfords, we're just starting to bring in and shout about that can really help. And I was up at Future Build last week looking at some products that if they hit the ground running as hard as I think they're going to, will revolutionise the amount of energy we use in our houses and the way that we insulate them. So that's really exciting, and that's the sort of thing that we'll showcase at those events. So our next event is in May, on May the 26th. It's at Somerset County Cricket Club. The event itself is invitation only, and I'm sure we'll send out to some of you guys in due course. But we also live stream it to anyone who wants to attend, and we're going to hold some remote events, but they're in Cornwall and Worcester, so probably not so important for you guys. But yeah, the goal is engage, inform, and inspire. They're absolutely aimed at what I would call our traditional customers, the trades and the developers, but they're also definitely aimed at local communities, local community groups in particular, so the likes of Somerset Can and the Retrofit Accelerator Project, all that kind of stuff, and then on down to individuals who are homeowners, business owners, etc., etc. So, and I've already seen there's been a link shared. The latest event, all the details are on there. I highly recommend tune in. The last one was genuinely, I'm slightly biased, but it was genuinely inspirational. There were presentations in there where no one blinked. So if we can achieve that this time, then it'll be a good show and a good turnout. I think that's probably me, Sonia. I've talked far too long.
Okay, great. Thank you, Giles. I think one thing that I was I'd like people to know you mentioned in our chat is that you're also working with some of the local colleges to train up young students of the building trade.
Yeah, what was really apparent at the event. So we invited Yeovil College, Bridgewater and Taunton, and Western College, the first and the last of whom we have really close relationships with, because they support our apprentice scheme. And what was really apparent was that the people that attended on that evening were, I think, quite surprised at what the future of building looked like. And I don't want to make any assumptions, but my guess is that a lot of the trade courses that occur, and again, I can't talk for the Retrofit Academy are clearly leading the way here in looking at what the future looks like, but I think there's quite a lot of teaching trades to do traditional building. So what we're doing is working with and making connections for those local colleges to really start to bring in what the future of building looks like for those students that are going through the courses. So for instance, Rockwool, who make insulation, were at our last event, and I know they're now in discussions with Western as to how they support their trades courses to ensure that those trades, clearly there's always a commercial agenda, but really to support those trades to understand what insulation needs to look like, what modern solutions are out there, and all that kind of stuff. So there's definitely work going on, and we'd encourage anyone who's sitting here who's got connections into the sort of college level of education, then give us a shout, and we're more than happy to include you in that conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Giles. That's amazing. We were going to have Hester next, but if it's okay, I'm going to quickly hand on to Phil, because I'm aware that he has to leave a little bit early. So I'm going to hand over to Phil Mason from Trustmark, because they're working on some solutions to some of the issues that have been encountered. And I thought it'd be good to hear it from the horse's mouth of what's actually going on. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, so thank you. I will start with an apology because I have to stop. I have a hard stop at 6:30. So very briefly, you may or may not have heard of Trustmark, but I probably just need to introduce it and why we're here. There was something called the Each Home Counts Review commissioned by the government several years ago to look at what happens when retrofit fails. And you might want to have a look at an experience at a place called Fishwick, which is near Preston. It's well publicised on the internet. And it's just an example. And it's not to frighten people. It's just a horror story about why retrofit goes wrong. So PAS 2035 was a standard that was created out of the Each Home Counts review. And again, there's a lot of there's a Each Home Counts website to get more information about the history behind it. But Trustmark has been put in place as a solution to poor retrofit under public funded government operated schemes. So we carry out that, we don't create PAS 2035. That's an industry standard created by the British Standards Institute. But what we do is carry out the compliance function at the back of it, where all work that is carried out under government funded schemes. And I've put some links into what those other funding schemes are, because they're probably funding streams that could easily support you in your area. They don't discriminate. They're across the country. So they're worth researching. But all the work gets lodged into what we call the Trustmark data warehouse, which is an information repository. And then we carry out audit and compliance at the back end of that with Trustmark registered businesses. So under those schemes, the assessors and the retrofit coordinators and the retrofit installers all have to be Trustmark registered. So that's just a very potted, very, very quick whistle stop tour, sort of potted history of what we do. But the challenges that I think exist are the fact that retrofit coordinators, retrofit assessors, and certificated retrofit installers are on relatively short supply, insofar that there are 2,500 Trustmark registered retrofit assessors, there's 400 retrofit coordinators registered with Trustmark, and there's 1,500 I should say, what we call PAS 2030 certificated installers. And we're not going to retrofit 24 million homes with that, I don't think. So there's an extreme demand on the supply chain. So PAS 2035 is for you to use voluntary. It's not inflicted on you, but when you look at Fishwick, you'll understand exactly why you need to embrace the principles around it, I would think, but it's voluntary. Using what we call PAS 2030 certificated installers isn't mandatory on you, and neither is Trustmark registration for any of those people, because this is about government funded schemes rather than the able to pay markets. But the thing that we're working with currently, and there's a lot of conversation, we've been working on documentation today and in the preceding days and the next few weeks, because we're in conversation and discussion with BEIS, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which is our government department, about how we extend out the supply chains. Because one thing that's really obvious, and some of you may have awareness of this already, there's already schemes, competent person schemes for electrical and insulation industries that are already government schemes. There are very, very reputable builders that have perhaps never heard of PAS 2035, but they probably already worked to the principles, because it's a well-established building principle. You go to site, you do an assessment, you build a design, you build a plan, then you build a design around it, then you execute the work. That's what good builders do anyway. So what we're trying to do is explore ways with our government department bays about how we can work with those people in either what might be a transitional process to get them into the certification standards that currently there isn't a huge amount of engagement around unless somebody's being paid to work in government schemes. So the majority, I would say the vast majority of people in your areas don't have access to these funded schemes, so their customers can't benefit from them because they don't have the certifications. But what we're trying to do is work out if there's an alternative route by those people, those non-certificated people can come in through Trustmark based on their existing competencies and some processes that we need to put in place so that we can dramatically support the expansion of the supply chains. Because as it sits at the moment, if you went out into, it's probably news to some of you already when we talk about PAS 2035 and PAS 2030, which is the associated installer certification, you're probably thinking already, wow, what does that actually already mean? Because it's such a narrow field. And this is why there's a huge need to work with the wider construction supply chains to be able to get them to engage and understand a little bit more about what retrofit is so that they can talk with more knowledge and information to their customers. And because it's a push and pull market, I think the construction industry sort of will need to push retrofit and educate consumers more widely, but consumers, and this is where you as a group are massively advanced on your thinking already, although I think you think you're already at the start of your chain, because there's groups of people like you needed all over the country to drive the education and the appetite from a consumer's perspective to say, I want to do some retrofit. What does it mean? How do I start? How do I do it safely? How do I fund it? And one of the other biggest conversations that we're having, there's a lot of very, very interested lenders and financiers in the UK that want to push lots and lots of money into the retrofit market, but based on historic experiences and failures, they're a little bit nervous about it. So that's why we're working closely with them as a compliance, as a registration and compliance scheme to say we've got a process that will engage more and more people. So you as lenders have the confidence to be able to lend into the able to pay market, which isn't eligible for government funding. And I think it's all about information. It's about driving the market, and it's about making sure that there's a sustainable and quality monitored delivery at the end of what happens. Because we can all retrofit, but there's good retrofit, and then we have experience of poor retrofit, and that's why the principles of PAS 2035 are here. So in the few minutes that I've got, unfortunately, and I really deeply regret it, because this is a considerably more interesting forum than perhaps I may necessarily have expected. Is there any direct questions for me that I'd be more than happy to take over the next few minutes? No. Okay. So that's either because I've answered every single question, or more likely, you need some time to digest the conversation. And I think I personally, subject to availability, or if not me personally, I'm sure that Trustmark is happy to engage with you further, because I think we can help you in terms of understanding. I think we can help you.
Actually, hang on a second, Philip. I think there's two people with their hands
up. Oh, I
actually.
Beg your pardon.
You know, there's two
Forgive me.
people with their hands up. I'm going to take Linda first.
Yes, let's do
Linda
that.
Wookie.
Thanks, Sonia. And thanks, Philip. That was really, really interesting. As a community energy organisation, we're starting to look at how we can support the retrofit market ourselves. And just curious of what you were saying, really, because we have been looking at retrofit coordination and assessment. But you're saying now that there could be some support coming through from Trustmark, which enables others that don't have those qualifications.
Well, what we're trying to do is a retrofit coordinator is quite a defined scope, qualified person, and it's a relatively new profession and qualification. But whilst we're waiting for an entire sector to engage with those standards, what we can't do, I think, based on some of the figures that Giles gave earlier, and there's nothing new in those figures because they're accurate, but there's something that I present. If we've got to do 2,300 something retrofits across the UK every single day for the next 28 years to meet net zero by 2050, with these figures that I've just read about the existing supply chains, we won't be able to do it. So we've got to find a way of helping other people to come into the retrofit market and have the standards of their work monitored. Now, you don't have to use Trustmark. You don't have to use a Trustmark registered business. But if you don't, and there's no compliance regime about it, and there are other compliance regimes, how do you know that retrofit is of a good standard and we don't get more fish wicks? I think is perhaps where I'm trying to go with that we won't be able to help financially, but it's well, not in our current guise, but it's really important that we help more and more of recognized competent tradesperson people in perhaps ahead of them getting these certification standards, or maybe there's some alternative route or alternative method where we can work either continuously side by side with certification, or whether certification becomes overruled by another process. That I suppose the markets dictate that.
I think it's also important, isn't it, in order to open up the grants that are available.
Yes.
I'm just going to quickly go to Dave Maxwell, please.
Yes, thanks very much. And it's very interesting. It's good to have, greater confidence being brought into the system. But my question is about whether the new standard past 2035 is aiming to achieve net zero. It's been mentioned. Can you say what sort of energy performance would be expected as a result of following this standard? Is that something that it does as well?
It doesn't prescribe that exactly. What it's about doing is looking at a house, looking at a dwelling, an individual dwelling, then prescribing a retrofit plan that is bespoke to that house that starts the property on the net zero journey. So there's something called a medium-term improvement that's generated out of it, and based on someone's budget, people with larger budgets may just do everything in one go and achieve net zero within one project. But past 2035 identifies the journey that the dwelling needs to go on, and then it's for the householder or the person that owns the house or is funding the project to say, well, actually, there's some low-hanging fruit that we can hit now, and there's a more extensive work that we might do later. For example, when we have other building works done, and we might combine them and get the economies of scale. So it isn't just a one-stop process; it's a staged process with the intention. I think with the wider intention by government to be rolled out nationally at some point. I'm not sure what the strategy is for that currently, so that there's a measured way of all domestic dwellings across the UK to be on a pathway to net zero. So you can see the wind down as we go, because at the moment we don't know what that journey looks like across the country.
Thank you. And if you've got time, if you've got 1 minute left,
it'd be discourteous not to.
Okay, I'll try and make it really quick. Thanks very much, Philip, for that really interesting presentation. As a householder who did have a retrofit under the Green Home Scheme, my first thought when you said about things that can go wrong, I thought with all those hoops and hurdles, how could anything ever go wrong? It was quite demanding for us, quite demanding for the installer. Now, somebody who's completely ignorant of Fishwick, could you just very briefly expand on what you're referring to there?
Okay, Fishwick, there's quite a lot of documentation published, and you actually draw some slides off the internet where dwellings were they had an external wall insulation applied to dwellings that were never suitable in the first place. Because before you get into retrofit, you need to understand the condition and type of property and whether it's actually eligible for certain measures. So this was about exterior wall insulation, but properties that were damp or in structural disrepair were externally wall insulated, but the external wall insulation was applied in such a poor way that water, either wind-driven rain or overspilling gutters, was actually getting to the back of the insulation. And there are photographs of people living in houses with mushrooms on the wall. So it's not an everyday occurrence, because there were such fundamental failings that the project should never have commenced, or where they should have commenced, they should have been commenced in such a way that they were project managed to actually do appropriate to offer an appropriate quality. Because you can imagine a house that's now got an exterior wall insulation overcoat on it, and yet there's water running to the back of that overcoat. It would be like wearing a wetsuit with a leak in it, or well, a dry suit with a leak in it, and then you've got the remediation issues, and that's what PAS eliminates is Fishwick. So Fishwick is a one-off thing. It's not a one-off thing. Don't go to bed at night worrying about Fishwick, because PAS 2035 process eliminates all those, is designed to eliminate all those issues. Right, I'm gonna have to cut and run, for want of a more polite expression.
Thank you so much, Philip, for joining us. That was
Okay.
a really great presentation and really helpful. Thank you very much.
Hope to see you again. Stay in touch. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Now we will go over to Hester to discuss some of the many issues that that Hester's encountered with people that she's been trying to help to get retrofits done in your area. Over to you, Hester.
Okay, thank you. Yes, this is Forum 21, now called Green Home, Green Network. And I've been, for many years, I've been visiting homes, talking to people about how to get home improvements done. And as you pointed out, until was it 2013, there were schemes, there were things, and I'm very sad that the draft proofing scheme stopped, because that helped a lot of people. And nobody now seems to do draft proofing at all. A lot of people need help to do it. So it would be really good if a scheme like that could be reintroduced by the council. At that time, there were lots of schemes. People didn't have their lofts and cavity walls done, so we could tell them how to get it done, and they did. There were schemes. EAGER was a very good organisation, and it helped people with heating systems. And then all that was withdrawn, so we have none of that anymore. So ever since then, I've been talking to people who live in cold, damp houses, who can't afford to turn the heating on at all, let alone turn it down. And there seems to be very little help for them. So these would be people who either have no surplus income, no way they'd get a retrofit assessment because they haven't got any money, or they have some money, but they can't afford to do everything, and probably wouldn't prioritise an assessment either, because that means there's less money to spend on the house. And I'm not sure how much thought is going into how to help these people. All the people I'm really talking about are people who have the wrong kind of house for the schemes that do exist. You know, the government's always going on about all the schemes to help do insulation, but really they do basic loft insulation and cavity wall insulation. Where I am, most of the houses don't have cavities, we don't have gas. An awful lot of us don't have the right kind of loft to do the basic insulation. It's all more complicated than that. Some of them are lofts you can't even get into. And I do talk to installers quite a lot, and I've talked to installers of all the different schemes as they've come and gone, about the reasons why they can't help the people who I'm trying to help. And it's basically because they've all stuck to a very narrow agenda, in my experience, that they are doing loft cavity and gas central heating. I've been successful with gas central heating, if anybody's anywhere near a gas supply. But we've had very little help for people with anything else. And I've had all sorts of reasons given. At one time, I was being told that if you have oil central heating, for some reason you can't have insulation through any of the schemes. If you have 4 inches of insulation in your loft, you can't have any more, because they don't do that. The people I'm meeting, rural people, all have 4 inches of something and oil. So we were kind of ruled out by the schemes right from the start. And I'm concerned really that the schemes that are now coming, we're now, Eco3 actually, I was given a very long list of things by a company of things that Eco3 would do. But I never saw any evidence at all in the houses I visit of any of it being done, apart from the things I've just mentioned. And I'm not aware of anybody really coming up with any suggestions for it. And I looked at Eco4 actually, what that's going to be about. But it seems that to get anything done to your heating, you have to have insulation. If you've got the wrong sort of house, you can't have insulation. There's nobody doing that. So therefore, you can't do anything. You're just left. So all these houses you're talking about getting done up, there's an awful lot of them. A lot of people I see are in EFG houses. Quite a lot of tenants, quite a lot of them are homeowners, but they all have that same basic. There's no money there to do any of this stuff to my house, therefore I'll give up. So I give them grants to help them pay for heating, and they carry on living in one room. So. And I think the Eco4, it says it wants to help people in all those houses, but there's always a reason why it can't happen. And the reason I could see in Eco4 seemed to be that it's this fabric first thing. You've got to have, obviously, yes, you should get your house insulated. If you can't, if you don't fit into the categories that they are able to do, then that won't happen, and you can't have anything at all. So you're stuck with your broken oil boiler, and there's really actually no way of getting anything else. And tenants, I took a lot of tenants, and they are terrified of talking to anybody about the state of their house because they're worried about being evicted. And to them, it's better to stay in the house that it is than to get thrown out of that house. And it's very hard to find anywhere else to live if that happens to you. So I think there are a lot of things we need to do. You're right about people. I do sometimes talk to people who can pay for something, but they don't do anything because of this lack of informed. They know they need to get good advice, informed advice. They know that asking their local builder is not going to probably get them what they need, and they don't know what they need. I tried asking actually people in Bradford's, but I've asked some installer companies as well for advice. But they all just said, ask your builder. And I know what happens when you ask your builder. I think I know more about it than they do. And I think it's important to spread out this advice you're talking about, to make it possible for people to get the retrofit assessment, even if they haven't got any money. Because I think a lot of people are already doing DIY. You know, we all go to somewhere and buy whatever they're selling on offer, and that's what we use. And I think if we want to get people doing a better job than that, then somehow we have to make this advice available to everybody, even if they haven't got any money, and also and make advice more easy to get. So, you know, I should be able to talk to somebody who sells insulation about the different kinds of insulation, and I've found they don't want to do that. And actually, I was very interested in hearing about all these new types of insulation, because I think that would make it really helpful for the DIY market, is to have some better products which may fit better into all our complicated old houses. Listing is the other one that I've come across. If you have a listed house, it makes that whole thing even more difficult, because you have to go through the whole business of listed buildings consents. Some things are a non-starter, you can't do that at all. The schemes are always too short-lived. I've tried a scheme and failed because the scheme comes and goes in the time that you're trying to get to your listed buildings consent. So that people give up, I think, for all these different reasons. I think does that tell you enough of what I'm thinking?
I think that's very well summed up. Thank you, Hester. There's a lot of issues that people in Somerset, and I suspect all over the southwest, indeed, are facing, and potentially elsewhere in the country too, but certainly in our part of the world, particularly, as you say, with listed buildings. But I'm hoping that some of those issues you can see are being addressed. For instance, the green register that Cara mentioned, I think might address some of the problems of putting together the correct products and people that we can approach, which hopefully, that would be really helpful. But yes, maybe we need to coordinate an approach to contact our MPs to discuss, get some of these issues put on the table, as Steve has suggested in the chat. Steve, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Sonia. Yeah, just a quick question, which I'm sure probably half the group here can answer, but I'll post it your way, Hester. With conservation areas, is it still the case that they're not allowed to install double glazing?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, I actually solved that problem. I have secondary glazing, and the council are very happy about secondary glazing, and it does make your house totally airtight. If you buy the ready-made plastic sheets, and they're very cheap. And I think more people ought to know about that, because it does solve the draft problem.
Brilliant. Thanks, Esther.
Keris, is that you having your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to add a point out to help answer your question a bit more, Steve. It's not completely true that it's out of the question to add double glazing to difficult buildings in conservation areas, or even if they're, especially listed grade 2 star or grade 1. It's just about an extra level of knowledge and sensitivity that makes sure that any measures are going in, particularly with regards to the appearance of the building, aren't going to undermine that heritage significance. So it does make it much more difficult. It obviously involves a greater degree of unpicking in context, which means investment in paying for specialist design expertise and going through all the consent applications. So it is much more difficult. So I can appreciate why Hester would say that it's not possible, because that's exactly how it will probably seem to a lot of people. So I'd be really interested in having a conversation with anyone else who's interested in trying to unpick how we can support more people in understanding what can be done in difficult scenarios.
And also in the chat, I've put on a lot of historic England work around energy efficiency improvements to old and precious buildings. So there is work going on, but as Cara said, you have to be far more sensitive in how you apply modern materials into an older building.
Sorry, Sonia, I was just gonna.
That's right. No, carry on, Steve.
That's really useful, and thanks, Cara, and thanks, Keris. That's really handy to get extra help. I think that's the nub of it, isn't it? It's when it's more expensive and much more difficult. The vast majority of people are just going to not do it. The example, but the reason I raise it is an example in the village just last week. The house has been completely renovated, and yeah, they've completely all new windows, and they're all single glazed, and yeah, there was probably a way they could have done it, but they didn't want to spend the extra money. It's just sort of breaks your heart when you're trying to get to net zero.
You can if you replace a single glazed window, you could just put in double glazing. As long as it looks the same and is the same window, you can have it double glazed. But like you say, yeah, it's a level of expense that most people probably wouldn't go for.
Yeah, I'm hopefully that might be the only positive thing coming out of the geopolitical situation going on out there at the moment is that this might be a really good time to push for all of these things to be changed in legislation, because it's high on the priority list, I think. Dave, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. First, just to check out, it's a more general question I've got. I wasn't sure, whether we were still just with Hester or opening up more widely, but if we're still with Hester, I'm happy to wait. No,
go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of, one main sort of point I'd like to try and make, and it will well lead to a question. And what an interesting discussion, showing what some of the issues are, and we've covered two sort of poles, and earlier speakers referred to this. To start with, the wealthy people able to pay, and worth noting also the very high carbon emitters, the ones who've got the worst carbon footprint, and then at the other end, people in extreme fuel poverty, who are struggling, who probably got really low carbon footprints, and have other needs which really need to be met. And in trying to deal with this, we're looking at all of those, this big range to address, and that's worth keeping in mind that we're talking about some different things here. And I think what most of us are keen to do is be on the journey to net zero. We've often referred to that, but what does it mean? And I think it's important that we're clear on this, and at some point it's going to mean we must stop putting gas boilers into properties, because when we put them in, they're going to likely to be there for another 15-20 years. So if you've got a target of 2030, you're building in, you can't achieve your target if we keep putting gas boilers in. So at some point we've got to stop that. We're probably not entirely there, but for those who can do, it's important that we do get there. So there's that. Now there are some standards that are set for this, but we've not really talked about those. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is that we should be knowing what's want to be achieved. And we often refer to the Centre for Alternative Technology and their Zero Carbon Britain. They identify, to get to Zero Carbon Britain, we need a 50% reduction in heating demand. So there is a target there to go for, which is in that. And there's something called the LETI, who have come up with a standard looking for both new build and for retrofit more recently over what should actually be achieved to get to net zero. They're actually aiming for a slightly higher performance than that. And that guide, as I understand it, is behind the net zero carbon toolkit, which authorities are starting to adopt, at least as guidance. Somerset West and Taunton's recently adopted it, so has Mendip, and possibly so have others, but some are being adopted it. And that gives you a guide as to what you should actually do to achieve the type of energy performance that is wanted. So I guess where this leaves me is I was really encouraged, especially by the first two, and the Zero Retrofit Accelerator Programme, what Bruton are doing. Can either of those say, are they adopting this sort of standard as somewhere where we need to be getting to?
Yeah, shall I go first? I mean, we wouldn't as a town council consider ourselves as experts in what standards to apply. So I think what we're doing is we're deferring to as we see it, the professional expertise of our coordinator, and she's applying the PAS 2035 standards to the way she does her work, and her own professional experience to the content of that work. So that doesn't quite answer your question, but that's certainly the approach we're taking in Bruton.
Cara, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I mean, certainly the whole point of retrofit really is to accelerate that decarbonisation of house emissions, and to support people to understand and have the choices in A, reducing their heat demand, and B, being able to choose heat pumps instead, or in some cases you can actually retrofit to a level that's as good as a passive house standard, so actually your heating demand is almost zero, so you don't really need much in terms of heating requirements. But certainly in terms of policy and planning, there's a huge amount of work that is going on behind the scenes, and Lifetime's homes that will be coming in soon will be improving energy efficiency. And I certainly know, having discussed with our planning authority at Somerset District Council, timescales to be able to put in some of the supplementary planning documents. That kind of has passed because of the new authority being formed, but that's something really important to embed in what happens in Somerset in terms of the new authority and who's taking on that planning application process, to embed all of this in the new authority, but also to realise that quite a lot of planning is actually held at central government, and it has caused issues, particularly in South Somerset, trying to push forward more sustainability when housing demand requirements have enabled developers to push back and say that some of these requirements mean they won't build and therefore won't meet their targets. So that's put a lot of problems in terms of planning authority being able to deliver their role. So that's really what I want to say.
Can I just come in and say a bit more, because I think this is echoing what Cara said. A retrofit coordinator is going to advise a homeowner about the choices they can make. So they can say that if you use this kind of heating system, it will cost you roughly this, and this will happen. This will be the carbon impact. This will be the impact on your energy bills if you use this kind. But they can't sort of, I think it would probably be wrong for them not to sort of present all the options to the homeowner in the current context. It would have to be government regulation through building control, or through a sort of building control standard for retrofit delivery would be the only kind of control that would actually say this has to happen. And at the moment, we're not in that context. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the way I see it.
Can I just a very quick comment, if I may? I mean, that's interesting. I think there are things local authorities can do. We've been stymied a bit by the unitary authority, but it is possible to up your targets, and local authorities around the country have done so. But there are barriers from government, absolutely. But yeah, I'll just give a plug again to the Net Zero Toolkit. Do have a look at it, see what it's got, and I would suggest if you can, you know, make that part of the choices that you're offering. I think that would be a really good thing to do, because that is about the journey to net zero, and unless you've got some idea of the standard you need to achieve, we won't get there. So I would urge you to have a look.
And although that's mainly around new build, I believe, Dave, I will put the link in the chat. There's a similar supplementary planning document that I've come across this week that's looking particularly at doing that for retrofit and renovation projects. So I'll add that in the chat.
Take a look. It's based on Letty, and Letty now cover retrofit as well.
Thanks, Dave. Giles, you had your hand up first, but you've put it down again. Is that because you've put your answer in the chat?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, great. In that case, I'm going to quickly go over to Steve, who's had his hand up next.
Great, thanks, Sonia. Yeah, Cara touched on it just then, and I just wanted to make a general plea that we do have these elections coming up for the new council, Somerset Council, on May 5th. So as Somerset can have been lobbying the different candidates or from other parties. And so I just, a plea really, that if anyone can really get the chance to email their candidate to ask them to really keep the climate and ecological emergency at the forefront of the new council when it starts to be formed is going to be key. And if they get lots of people telling them it's important, then there's a good chance it'll be taken forward. So yeah, just a little plea from me and from Somerset Can. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And I think probably going to be the last question from Ganesh. You've got your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So just to expand, I'm from Burnham-on-Sea, where I think it's fair to say we're sort of you know at a very early stage of any kind of journey towards sustainability as a community, you know, as a sort of collective community. Question for Bruton, actually, partly because I was really interested in the work you're doing. I didn't get a sense from your presentation as to what level of actual take up you had. You know, how many people went for the you know, the assessment and actually implemented something, or is it too early to say? Maybe I've misunderstood the timescales. And I guess following on from what a previous questioner was asking, you know, the fact that actually some of the people who've got the means to sort of do something financially are perhaps, and also the biggest opportunity, are also perhaps you know, the least willing to actually take hold of this issue. And I just wonder whether that was an obstacle you found in your work.
I think, I mean, I don't want to jump on anybody else, but I think I can answer both of those points. Obviously, the first one, we've had a lot of interest in our website. We've had over 20 people who've asked for assessments. I can't remember how many have actually been done, but it's not all the 20 yet. There is a very long lag time between actually having your assessment, between getting deciding what you need to do, finding a builder, moving on and getting it done. So I'm only aware of one person so far out of those 20 who's actually moving to getting things done. So that's the statistics. Your comment about the people who have the you know the better off people who are perhaps the higher emissions, that's not wanting to do anything. That's not strictly speaking true. There's quite a lot of research about attitudes to climate change being done, and they tend to show that it's much more evenly spread across the political and economic spectrum than you might expect. that there are groups of extremely rich people who are not interested. It's true, but actually there are an awful lot of people who are in a position to do something, who want to do something about it and are looking for guidance. So I think that's a bit of a, without sounding confrontational, I think that's a bit of a stereotype about people who are well off and sort of high emitters, if you like.
Yeah, no, thank you. I deliberately put it in a sort of provocative way to in the hope that you would say what you've said, which is encouraging. And I think your first point or your first set of stats, I guess that just underlines the supply chain issues that have been well rehearsed over the last hour and a half. So it seems to all come back to that crunch at the supply end rather than the demand end almost. So that's interesting to know. Thank you.
Thanks, Ganesh, for your question. Is there anybody else before we wrap up? I don't think anyone else has got their hands up. Yeah, thank you very much to all the presenters. I think that was incredibly informative, and I hope that that's prompted some useful conversations going forward. And I hope that you can see that the collaboration that's coming up between all the different organisations will hopefully lead to something much more useful that's happened in the past. And from my perspective, completely as a lay person, I think the free retrofit assessor, I think you're absolutely right, Cara and James, that you're providing that link for people to get that plan, that kind of here's your next steps, is much more likely to catapult people into actually doing something. So it's so great to see that happening here in Somerset, and really amazing to hear from a couple of our other speakers, like Phil from Trustmark, saying that we're actually at the forefront country-wise. Always really encouraging. So again, well done Somerset and us. So I will send round slides and links and notes. If we didn't get recordings from before, we'll make a note of questions that came up and the answers that happened for those. Thanks everyone for attending and your time, and we'll see you again soon.
Great. Thanks everybody. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you. Thanks. Happy retrofit.